The silence on the bridge of a destroyer is heavier than the noise of battle. When the guns stop firing and the depth charges stop exploding, there is a moment where every man on the ship holds his breath, waiting for the ocean to deliver a verdict. On a freezing night in December 1940, 40 miles west of Ireland, Lieutenant Commander Frederick John Walker stood gripping the railing of HMS Stork, staring into the black water. Minutes earlier, his ASTIC sonar team had reported a solid contact. They had executed the attack perfectly according to the Royal Navy manual. Approach at speed, cross the target, release a diamond pattern of high explosives set to detonate at 150 and 300 feet. The ocean had erupted in white geysers, shaking the destroyer like a toy. Now, Walker waited for the debris. He waited for the oil slick, the shattered wood, the bodies that would confirm a kill. But the Atlantic offered nothing. The water settled. The silence returned. The U-boat was gone. It was a scene repeating itself with terrifying frequency across the western approaches. To the men in the Admiralty warm offices in London, a missed attack was a statistic. To Frederick Walker, it was a personal failure that measured in human lives. He knew that the submarine that had just escaped him would surface within hours. It would recharge its batteries, race ahead of the slow-moving merchant convoy Walker was sworn to protect, and by dawn, another tanker or freighter would be burning. Men would scream as they burned in oil-slicked water, and their deaths would be the direct result of a naval doctrine that was fundamentally broken. Walker turned from the rail and walked back into the chart house, his face a mask of fury. He didn't blame his crew. He didn't blame the equipment. He blamed the mathematics. And while the rest of the Royal Navy slept or followed orders, Frederick Walker opened a notebook and began to calculate why he was losing the war. To understand the magnitude of Walker's frustration, one must understand the desperate reality of Britain in early 1941. The island nation was not just losing the Battle of the Atlantic, it was being strangled. The German U-boat fleet, commanded by the brilliant tactician Admiral Karl Dönitz, was sinking Allied shipping faster than it could be built. The ratio was catastrophic. 4 ships sunk for every 1 U-boat destroyed. Britain had 6 weeks of food reserves left. Churchill's nightmares were filled not with the Blitz or invasion, but with the graphs showing tonnage lost at sea. The Royal Navy's response to this existential threat was the depth charge, a 300-pound barrel of TNT dropped from the stern of a destroyer. Theoretically, it was a lethal weapon. In practice, it had a success rate of less than 3%. For every 100 attacks launched by British escorts, 97 resulted in the U-boat escaping to kill again. The Admiralty's experts concluded that this failure rate was due to the inherent difficulty of anti-submarine warfare. They argued that the Atlantic was too big, the sonar too primitive, and the enemy too elusive. They were wrong. Frederick John Walker was 44 years old, a man whose career had seemingly hit a dead end. In a Navy that valued social connections and adherence to tradition, Walker was an anomaly. He was obsessive, socially abrasive, and possessed of a mind that refused to accept "that's how we've always done it" as a valid argument. He had been passed over for promotion to captain multiple times. While his contemporaries commanded cruisers and battleships, Walker was left commanding a destroyer in the unglamorous escort force. But this exile gave him something the admirals didn't have: thousands of hours of staring at sonar screens and watching attacks fail. He turned his cabin aboard HMS Stork into a private research laboratory. He analyzed the geometry of failure. The problem, Walker realized, was time. The standard Royal Navy attack procedure was a relic of the First World War. When a destroyer detected a submarine on ASTIC, it would accelerate to attack speed. As the ship rushed over the target, the sonar beam, which looked ahead of the ship, would inevitably lose contact as the destroyer passed directly over the submarine. This created a blind time of approximately 30 seconds between the last sonar contact and the moment the depth charges rolled off the stern. The Admiralty assumed the submarine would continue on its last known course. But the German U-boat commanders were not idiots. They knew exactly how ASDIC worked. As soon as they heard the destroyer's propellers speed up for the attack run, they didn't hold their course. They executed a crash dive, tilting the boat down at a 45-degree angle and turning hard to port or starboard. Walker ran the numbers in his notebook, scribbling furiously under the dim light of a swaying lamp. A German Type 7 U-boat crashing diving could descend at 280 feet per minute. In the 30 seconds of blind time while the destroyer was rushing overhead, the U-boat wasn't sitting at 150 feet waiting to be blown up. It was transitioning. It was diving through the shallow water, frantically trying to get deep. The Admiralty doctrine mandated that depth charges be set to explode at 150 and 300 feet, based on the assumption that U-boats would dive deep immediately. But Walker's calculations proved that during the critical moment of the attack, the U-boat was actually much shallower, likely between 50 and 100 feet. The Royal Navy was dropping its explosives under the target. The shock waves were hammering the submarines from below, shaking them, but not cracking their hulls. They were banging on the door, but not kicking it in. The solution seemed blindingly simple to Walker. Change the settings. Set a pattern of depth charges to explode at 50 feet. Create a shallow water killing zone that the U-boat had to pass through to escape. But in the Royal Navy of 1941, simple did not mean allowed. Depth charge settings were not suggestions. They were orders codified in fleet manuals. To change them was to violate the Naval Discipline Act. A commander couldn't just decide to use explosives differently because he had a hunch. But Walker wasn't interested in being a good officer. He was interested in killing submarines. In January 1941, Walker submitted a formal proposal to Western Approaches Command. He detailed his blind time theory and requested permission to implement a new firing pattern with shallow set charges. The response from the Admiralty was swift, bureaucratic, and crushing. The proposal was rejected. The letter cited safety concerns. A 300-pound charge detonating at 50 feet might damage the destroyer dropping it. It also cited tactical doctrine. U-boats operated at depth, and attacking shallow water was a waste of munitions. The message was clear. Stay in your lane, Lieutenant Commander. Do what you are told. Walker ignored them. It was a decision that could have led to a court-martial, stripping him of his rank and pension. But out in the gray wastes of the Atlantic, the Admiralty felt very far away, and the U-boats were very close. On his next patrol, Walker gathered his officers in the wardroom of HMS Stork. He explained the new tactics. They would not follow the standard diamond pattern. They would not set charges to 150 feet. They would set nearly half their explosives to detonate at 50 feet, a suicidal distance according to the manual. His gunnery officer pointed out that the blast would likely lift the stern of their own ship out of the water. Walker simply nodded and said, "Then hold on to something." The first test was terrifying. Attacking a contact west of Scotland, Walker ordered the shallow pattern. When the charges detonated, the ocean didn't just boil, it cracked. The shock wave hit the Stork with the force of a sledgehammer. Light bulbs shattered in the corridors. Dust shook from the overhead pipes. Men were thrown from their bunks. But when the spray settled, the sonar operator reported something new. It wasn't the usual silence. It was the sound of breaking up, the grotesque metallic groaning of a pressure hull imploding under hydrostatic pressure. They hadn't just scared the U-boat, they had gutted it. Walker filed a report claiming a probable kill. He also honestly reported the modifications he had used. He expected interest. Instead, he got a reprimand. A communiqué arrived ordering him to cease non-standard depth charge settings immediately. The Admiralty was more concerned with the uniformity of procedure than the destruction of the enemy. They were fighting a war by the book, while the Germans were rewriting the rules every night. Walker was summoned to Liverpool to explain himself to Admiral Sir Percy Noble, the Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches. The meeting in Liverpool was less a debriefing and more a trial. Walker stood before a table of senior officers and technical experts who viewed him as a loose cannon. Captain Reginald Thornton from the Anti-Submarine Division led the attack, accusing Walker of recklessness and insubordination. He argued that if every captain invented his own tactics, the fleet would dissolve into chaos. He pointed out the danger to the ships. He waved the rulebook. Walker stood at attention, listening to the men who had presided over a 3% kill rate tell him how to fight. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but laced with the razor-sharp edge of exhaustion. "Sir," Walker said, addressing Admiral Noble directly, ignoring the others, "the enemy is not reading our tactical manuals. They are diving through the gap in our doctrine." "You are worried about cracking the hull of a destroyer? I am worried about the 3,000 merchant seamen who died last month because we are dropping fireworks instead of killing blows. I have done the math. The Germans are escaping through the shallow zone. If you forbid me from closing that gate, you are signing the death warrants of the next convoy." The room went silent. It was deeply improper for a lieutenant commander to speak to senior staff with such emotional intensity. Thornton looked ready to arrest him. But Admiral Noble was a pragmatist. He looked at the charts Walker had brought. He looked at the simulation results provided by Gilbert Roberts, the maverick tactician who ran the wargaming unit in the basement. Roberts had secretly tested Walker's theories and found they tripled the kill probability. Noble made a decision that broke the chain of command. He didn't officially change the doctrine. That would take months of committee meetings in London. Instead, he issued a tactical memo authorizing individual commanders to use discretion. It was a loophole. It was permission to disobey. Walker returned to HMS Stork with a grim satisfaction. He had his permission. Now he had to prove that his math wasn't just a theory. Fate, possessing a dark sense of irony, decided to test him immediately. On March 17, 1941, Walker was escorting convoy HX-112 south of Iceland. In the wolf pack shadowing them were not just any U-boats, but the elite of the Kriegsmarine, specifically U-99, commanded by Otto Kretschmer, the silent Otto, the top-scoring ace of the war, and U-100, commanded by Joachim Schepke, the daring celebrity of the Nazi propaganda machine. These two men had sunk nearly 100 Allied ships between them. They were invincible. They were the apex predators, and they had no idea that the rules of the game had just changed. The night of March 16th was a massacre. The U-boats penetrated the convoy screen, torpedoing 5 tankers in quick succession. The horizon was lit by burning fuel. Panic spread through the merchant lines. But amidst the chaos, Walker did not charge in blindly. He slowed HMS Stork down. He coordinated with another destroyer, HMS Vanoc. He waited. At 0300 hours, Vanoc's radar, a primitive, unreliable set, picked up a blip. It was Schepke's U-100, running on the surface, confident in the darkness. Schepke dove immediately, assuming he was safe once he was underwater. He expected the destroyers to rush over him, drop deep charges, and miss. He initiated his standard evasion, turning hard and crashing through the shallow zone. Walker was waiting. He ordered the attack, but this time the depth charges were set to 50 feet. The explosions were almost instantaneous. The shock waves didn't have to travel through hundreds of feet of water. They hammered U-100 while it was still struggling to dive. The submarine was smashed upward, its systems paralyzed, its crew thrown against the bulkheads. Schepke, the man who had laughed at the Royal Navy, found his boat uncontrollable. He was forced to surface. As the conning tower broke the water, HMS Vanoc surged out of the darkness and rammed the U-boat at full speed. Shepka was crushed on his own bridge. But the night wasn't over. Less than an hour later, Walker's sonar picked up another contact. It was U-99. Kretschmer, seeing his colleague destroyed, tried to slip away deep. Walker tracked him with a terrifying, cold precision. He directed the attack, again using the illegal, shallow settings mixed with deep ones to create a wall of pressure. The charges bracketed U-99. The lights failed inside the submarine. The pressure hull groaned and buckled. Water sprayed into the control room. For the first time in the war, Otto Kretschmer, the king of tonnage, had no move left. He blew his ballast tanks and surfaced. HMS Walker's searchlights pinned the U-boat against the black water. The Germans scrambled out of the hatch, hands raised. In one night, using tactics the Admiralty had tried to ban, Frederick Walker had eliminated the two greatest threats in the Atlantic. He had proved that the invincible U-boats were just machines, and like any machine, they could be broken if you understood the physics. The news electrified London. The ban on shallow settings quietly vanished. But for Walker, this was just the beginning. He had fixed the depth charge, but he knew the Germans would adapt. They would go deeper. They would get quieter. And so, in his cabin, amidst the smell of stale tobacco and salt water, Walker opened a fresh notebook. He began to sketch a new idea, one that required two ships to move in a deadly, silent ballet. He called it the creeping attack, and it would demand even more from his exhausted crew. The war was far from over, and Frederick Walker was just getting started. By 1943, the Atlantic Ocean had evolved. The early days of the war, when U-boats could surface with impunity and pick off merchant ships like ducks in a shooting gallery, were gone. Frederick Walker's innovation, the illegal shallow depth charge setting, had changed the physics of the battlefield. The German U-boat commanders, surviving the slaughter of 1941, had learned a brutal lesson. The surface was death. The shallow water was death. Survival lay in the deep. Admiral Donitz instructed his captains to dive immediately upon detection, to plunge to 500, 600, even 700 feet, far below the reach of standard British tactics. They learned to listen. The moment they heard the high-pitched ping of ASDIC sonar or the thrashing propellers of a destroyer speeding up for an attack, they would execute radical evasive maneuvers in the crushing darkness of the abyss. Walker, now promoted to captain and given command of the 2nd Support Group, watched this evolution with the cold detachment of a scientist. He realized that his previous victory was temporary. The shallow trap he had invented was no longer catching enough prey because the prey had changed its habits. The new problem was acoustic warning. To attack a deep submarine, a destroyer had to steam over the target. To get there quickly, it had to run its engines at high speed. The noise of a destroyer at 20 knots was deafening underwater. It gave the U-boat commander a 2-minute warning to turn, stop, or change depth. By the time the charges dropped, the submarine was half a mile away. The Royal Navy was once again bombing empty water. Walker sat in his cabin aboard his new flagship, the sloop HMS Starling, and devised a solution that was even more radical than his last. It required a level of coordination that most captains thought impossible. It required patience, a quality rarely found in combat. He called it the creeping attack. The concept was terrifyingly elegant. It required two ships. One ship, the director, would stand off a mile away from the target, moving slowly, holding the U-boat firmly in its sonar beam. It would not attack. It would simply watch, like a pointer dog freezing on a bird. The second ship, the executioner, would approach the submarine at a crawl, 5 knots or less. At this speed, the destroyer was almost silent. The U-boat's hydrophones would hear nothing but the distant pinging of the director ship, which seemed to be keeping its distance. The German captain would think he was safe, unaware that the executioner was gliding directly over his head, guided by radio signals from the director. There would be no engine roar, no warning, just the sudden, catastrophic arrival of depth charges raining down from a silent ocean. In June 1943, Walker took the second support group into the Bay of Biscay to test his new theory. The bay was the U-boat superhighway, the transit route for submarines leaving France for the Atlantic. It was heavily defended, but Walker didn't care. On June 24th, his group detected U-119. The submarine immediately went deep, expecting the usual high-speed rush. Instead, Walker ordered HMS Kite to hold contact while HMS Starling crept forward. The bridge was silent. Men spoke in whispers. They drifted over the target position. Walker gave the signal. The depth charges rolled off the rails. Down below, the crew of U-119 heard nothing until the hull-shattering explosions bracketed them. The surprise was total. The damaged submarine was forced to the surface, where Starling rammed it and sent it to the bottom. The creeping attack worked, but Walker wasn't satisfied with just killing U-boats. He wanted to annihilate them. He introduced the barrage attack, ordering 3 ships to line up abreast and carpet-bomb the ocean with depth charges, creating a moving wall of explosives that no maneuver could escape. The second support group became a legend. They were a hunter-killer group, freed from the duty of escorting slow convoys. Their only job was to find trouble. Walker trained them relentlessly. When they returned to port in Liverpool, the crews were exhausted, deafened by gunfire, and covered in salt, but they walked with the swagger of apex predators. Walker instituted a peculiar tradition. Whenever the flotilla returned with a kill, the sound system of HMS Starling would blast the tune, "A Hunting We Will Go," across the harbor. It was psychological warfare, a signal to the Admiralty and the public that the Johnnie Walker Band was back. But the war was taking a terrible toll on the man himself. Walker was 47 years old, but he looked 60. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and ringed with dark shadows. He refused to rest. While at sea, he virtually lived on the bridge, sleeping in a chair for an hour here and there, surviving on sandwiches and cigarettes. He was possessed. He knew that every U-boat that escaped him would kill merchant sailors. He took every loss personally. His son Timothy had been killed in action, serving on a submarine in the Mediterranean. The war had taken Walker's flesh and blood. In return, he would take the Kriegsmarine apart, piece by piece. The climax of his career, and the breaking point of his body, came in early 1944. In a single patrol spanning 3 weeks in February and March, the second support group achieved the impossible. It began on January 31st, when they caught U-592, creeping attack, destroyed. Then U-762, destroyed. On February 18th, U-734 was detected. The German captain was skilled, diving to 900 feet and maneuvering wildly. Walker hunted him for 8 hours. He didn't rush. He simply held on, directing his ships like a conductor, dropping barrage after barrage until the ocean crush depth did the rest. The patrol became known as the 6-in-1 trip. Walker's group sank 6 U-boats in a single voyage. It was a feat of destruction unequaled in the history of naval warfare. During one engagement, the entire flotilla was chasing a contact when a second U-boat was detected. In a moment of pure naval audacity, Walker signaled General Chase, a command rarely used since the days of Lord Nelson and the Battle of Trafalgar. It meant break formation and attack at will. It was the ultimate expression of confidence in his captains. They swarmed the enemy. When Starling finally steamed up the River Mersey to Liverpool, the crowds lining the docks were 10 deep. The First Lord of the Admiralty was there to greet him. The bands played. Walker stood on the bridge, waving, but those close to him saw the trembling in his hands. He was a man running on fumes. The end came not from a German torpedo, but from the limits of human endurance. In July 1944, just weeks after the D-Day landings made safe partly because Walker's group had cleared the Channel approaches, he collapsed. He was hospitalized in Liverpool. The doctors diagnosed him with cerebral thrombosis, but the real cause was simpler. He had worked himself to death. His brain and heart, subjected to years of adrenaline, freezing cold, and sleepless vigilance, simply shut down. On July 9, 1944, Captain Frederick John Walker died. He was 48 years old. His funeral was a state event in all but name. 1,000 officers and men from the Western Approaches Command marched through the streets of Liverpool. His casket, draped in the Union Jack, was carried not to a cemetery, but to a destroyer. He was taken out into the Irish Sea, to the edge of the Atlantic battleground he had ruled, and committed to the deep. The legacy of Frederick Walker is not found in statues or history books, where he is often overshadowed by the famous generals and politicians. It is found in the numbers. The ships under his command sank 20 U-boats, more than any other commander in the war. The tactics he developed, the shallow setting, the creeping attack, the barrage, were adopted by the entire Allied fleet and accounted for dozens more. It is estimated that the tactical revolution started by Walker in his lonely cabin aboard HMS Stork saved over 10 million tons of Allied shipping and at least 15,000 lives. Most importantly, he broke the psychological stranglehold of the U-boat. Before Walker, the submarine was a terrifying, invisible ghost that struck from the dark. After Walker, the submarine was hunted prey. He proved that the enemy was not a phantom. It was just a machine operating within the laws of physics. And if you were smart enough, brave enough, and willing to break the rules of the Admiralty to do it, you could kill it. Years later, a German U-boat veteran who had survived the war was asked about the Battle of the Atlantic. He mentioned the fear of aircraft and the cold, but then he paused. "The worst thing," he said, "was when you heard the starling, because when you met Captain Walker, you knew that the water was no longer hiding you. You knew that he could see you in the dark." Frederick Walker never became an admiral. He never received a knighthood during his life. He was a troublemaker to the very end. But in the cold, gray waters of the North Atlantic, where the fate of the free world was decided, he was the only thing that mattered. He was the man who won.